This was the cover of a major Israeli newspaper in March 2019. And the text, besides the image here, talks about dozens of anti-Semitic events that took place in every corner of the world, one after another, within less than 3 weeks. And these aren't Jewish people who reported that they're being treated unfairly. These are desecrated cemeteries, graffitis and swastikas on Jewish sites and monuments, vandalism, and violence. So how could it be that in the 21st century, anti-Semitism isn't just resurging, but is actually spreading and intensifying globally? What is it about hatred of Jews that humanity just can't seem to shake off? Throughout history, Jews have been hated and blamed for pretty much anything and its opposite. They were deemed responsible for the death of Jesus, but also for inventing Christianity. They've been labeled warmongers as well as cowards. Communists considered them accused them of creating capitalism. Capitalists accused them of creating communism. They were being hated for being arrogant, but also treated as an inferior race. When they donate, they're ostentatious hypocrites. When they don't, they're greedy moneymakers. They're blamed for being racists who seclude themselves from society and at the same time ruthless cosmopolitans who push for globalist agendas. Somehow, to this day, anti-Semitism manages to transcend geography, culture, religion, language. It even transcends politics. And anti-Semitism on the far right is easier to identify when people in Charlottesville holding torches and swastikas are chanting, "Jews will not replace us." But anti-Semitism on the far left is a lot more dangerous, perhaps, because it's capable of infiltrating the mainstream under the guise of criticism on the State of Israel. And before you know it, anti-Semitic propaganda becomes normalized. And just to remind you, this is Belgium in 2019. This is Nazi Germany in 1936. So why do people all over the world share this gut-level, irrational hatred that is sort of mutating like a virus throughout history, yet never goes away? Even if someone, say, is doing some really good global incitement work, why is it working so well? Why does it catch on so easily? What if this feeling has a reason that goes beyond politics, beyond religion, beyond culture? What if there's something happening in the human network between Jews and non-Jews, yet neither of them understands what that is? Let's start here. Let's look at humanity beyond religion, politics, and culture. Let's look at human society as a network. Let me show you some examples just so we're on the same page. This is a network of fungi in a petri dish. This is a network of neurons in the human brain. This is a cosmic network of some 24,000 galaxies as they're held together by gravity. From the micro to the macro, nature is full of networks, and humanity, too, is a network. This means that humanity is interconnected and interdependent, and influences spread throughout the network. And this is where the authentic wisdom of Kabbalah steps in. See, in contrast to all sorts of misconceptions and misinterpretations, Kabbalists are people who research the deeper binding force of nature that connects us above all differences, that connects all human beings. Kabbalah is the science of connection. It explains how human beings are inherently connected to each other and to the governing system of nature. It explains the deeper laws of nature that govern the human network and how it evolves. So, as it happens with other organisms, Kabbalah explains that humanity is evolving towards a higher level of complexity and connection, becoming a kind of globally integrated superorganism. Essentially, all of nature moves towards greater complexity and greater connection, and it happens layer by layer. So if you think, for example, about how different atoms join to create molecules, and molecules join to create macromolecules, such as DNA and others, and they become organelles, which are essentially minuscule organs that carry out specific functions in the cell, which is the basic unit of life. And cells, many of them come together to tissues, and they create different kinds of tissues which together form organs, and organs come together and form organ systems, and organ systems become living organisms. And so more complexity and more connection gives us a higher level of being. You are a higher level of being made possible by some 50 trillion cells that are working in a globally integrated fashion. And me too, and every one of us. So how does that happen in the case of humanity? Kabbalah explains that nature has to create a mini model of global connection, of a global kind of interdependence and unity, which can later spread throughout the human network. So how does that happen? Let me take you back some 3,800 years ago to ancient Mesopotamia. This piece of land here, which is more or less today's Iraq, a little bit of Kuwait, a little bit of Syria, but mostly Iraq, is considered the cradle of human civilization. This piece of land, which is between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, had stable climate and rich soil and a steady supply of fresh water that enabled thriving agriculture. And some of the world's first cities were created here. Innovations that have changed the face of humanity forever happened here, like writing on clay, that afterwards turned to the writing that we're familiar with, like astronomy, like law, like mathematics. Why do we have 60 seconds in a minute? It comes from there. Why do we have 60 minutes in an hour? How many months do we have in a year? All of that stuff comes from there. Thousands of years later, we're still using the same infrastructures for human culture that were developed there. And this point here, Babylon, which was probably the most successful city, became the cultural center of humanity. See, back then, we're talking about a time where there are just a few million people in the world. Estimations move from 1 to 30 million and over 200,000 in Babylon. So that's it. And so what happens there? Besides all the development, something else happened. And that was the growth of the human ego. Let me explain. If you go further back in history, human beings were less evolved as individuals. They had a more instinctive kind of connection to each other and to nature itself. Now, as humans evolved, their sense of self evolved, and they grew apart from each other and from nature. They became more individualistic beings, and by consequence, a more complex society. Kabbalah refers to this process as the growth of the human ego. And so Kabbalah explains that Babylon, some 3,800 years ago, was the place and time when the human ego reached a certain peak. And this is the meaning behind the story of the Tower of Babel that a lot of us are familiar with. That tower that people couldn't build because they stopped understanding each other and they ended up scattering across the globe. See, but among the Babylonians was actually one of the first Kabbalists that, in fact, all of you probably heard of. He saw that the rise of the human ego was a natural dynamic, that it had to happen in order for human beings to then consciously raise their level of connection. Abraham started a movement of those who wanted to consciously discover the binding force of nature. Now remember, this is Babylon. This is the cultural center of humanity at the time, which means that representatives from the various groups and tribes and clans of humanity were already there. Abraham gathers those who wanted to work on unity above their differences, and that group was later called Yehudim, which means Jews, which comes from the word Yehud, meaning unity. Here's a quote from Maimonides. He writes this about 850 years ago. He says that Abraham went from city to city, kingdom to kingdom, until thousands and tens of thousands joined, and they are the people of the house of Abraham, and they became a nation. So, different individuals from the different groups in humanity joining together to form something new. Sounds familiar? Here's another quote. Sfat Emet, which is a known Kabbalistic book written about 150 years ago, says, Yehudi, Jewish, means Yechidi, one who clings to the point of life, which is where unity lies. Noam Elimelech, another Kabbalist, writes it almost 300 years ago. Abraham planted the seed of love for all people of the world. See, Kabbalists throughout the centuries knew this. They knew the little-known birth story of the Jewish people, and they passed it down from Kabbalist to Kabbalist. So, remember, humanity is a network. So, where are we now? Right now, we have two groups. One with representatives from essentially all of humanity that managed to achieve the higher degree of connection, of human connection, and the rest of humanity. And so, since the moment this group was formed, a deep-seated demand from them to deliver what they have was embedded in the system because it's one holistic integrated network. In other words, the creation of the Jewish people and the inherent sentiments towards them are two sides of the same coin. They're opposite aspects of the same process. And it's fascinating to compare what Kabbalists say based on their attainment of the human network and what some anti-Semitic ideologues are saying based on their anti-Semitic intuition, if you will. Henry Ford was known for holding deep anti-Semitic views, and he writes this about 100 years ago. Society has a large claim against the Jew that he sees his exclusiveness and that he begin to fulfill. In a sense, his exclusiveness has never yet enabled him to fulfill the ancient prophecy that through him all the nations of the earth should be blessed. He also writes, modern reformers who are constructing model social systems would do well to look into the social system under which the early Jews were organized. Now here is what the preeminent Kabbalist of the 20th century, who was the author of the commentary on the book of Zohar, he writes this also about 100 years ago. The Israeli nation had been established as a kind of gateway by which the sparks of purity will flow onto all of mankind across the world until they develop and come to understand the pleasantness and serenity of love of others. So, if nature created this model of global unity, now the question is, how does it expand to the rest of the network? And the answer is that nature has to send that group to mingle with the rest of humanity while both groups are now spreading physically throughout the globe. And this process takes about 2,000 years, where the vast majority of Jews lose their deep conscious connection that essentially created them, and they find themselves roaming the world. And guess what? Wherever they go, they're persecuted. Here is an incomplete list of Jewish expulsions and pogroms and the like, slavery, and this is quite a small font, and these are 2 columns on 1, 2, 3 slides. See, Jews have been persecuted from Babylon to Rome to England to Mississippi, and the list goes on. Obviously, the recent major event that we all remember is the Holocaust, which leaves a unique and powerful imprint in the collective consciousness of mankind. And somehow, by way of nature, that group manages to survive all of that and even establish the State of Israel some 70 years ago, which leads us back to the 21st century. Where are we now? The world has become a global village, a modern-day Babylon, if you will. And it's interesting to see that all the risks that we face today, whether they're social, political, economic, technological, ecological, they're all interdependent across the globe, and they require some form of a higher level of global cooperation to occur in the human network. And so we're in a very unique situation. The vast majority of Jews unconsciously carry a method for human connection, and the world demonstrates growing anti-Semitism, which is an unconscious demand to rise to a new level of connection. And so if Jews rekindle their inherent connection, they can start a chain reaction of connection in the network, which is ultimately the solution to anti-Semitism. However, Kabbalah explains that just like in the times of Abraham, anyone can access the method of connection regardless of gender, race, nationality. You can be American, European, African, Asian, Australian. You can be from Antarctica for that matter. So just like in the times of Abraham, the seed of human connection can grow in every person. And so what's happening correspondingly in the 21st century is that the integration process has been completed and the foundations have been laid, and the new global level of connection is now about to emerge, and people all over the world are awakening to that consciousness that we are actually one collective entity. To conclude, Kabbalah explains that all of us are being pushed to discover that we are one body and to rise to a conscious experience of our connection to each other and to nature itself. As Kabbalist Yehuda Ashlag Bar Sulam writes, "It is certain and unequivocal that the purpose of creation lies on the shoulders of the whole human race, black, white, or yellow, without any difference whatsoever."